All right! Now that we've blown up that room, let's go through the next door. As you open the door, you see 4 goblins crouched in the center of the next chamber. They're gathered around a crude fire, cooking a pot of stew. A thick, meaty smell wafts over you. But as the hinges of the door creak, the goblins whirl around, drawing their swords. Hang on a sec. If they heard the door creak, how did they not hear the giant explosion in the room next door 30 seconds ago? What? Or the fight before that, right? I mean, why didn't they come help their friends, or fetch reinforcements, or run away? Oh, crap. I think we broke the DM. As a game master, the great thing about a dungeon is that it's firewalled. When you're running a dungeon, the only thing you need to look at is the room the PCs are currently in. It's super simple. Everything you need is right at your fingertips. The drawback, of course, is that this results in a very static scenario. If the PCs are fighting goblins in Area 43, it feels like the goblins in Area 44 should hear them and come rushing over to help. But because they're behind the firewall, because the GM is only looking at Area 43, they don't. That's the limitation of a static dungeon. So you want to be a game master, on the other hand, teaches you how to run dynamic dungeons. This seems pretty simple. You think to yourself, okay, when there's a fight, I should scan nearby rooms to see if there's anyone who might hear what's happening. And if you've gained enough experience as a game master, and if there are only 1 or 2 rooms nearby, you can probably make that work. It's definitely harder. You're having to flip back and forth between different room keys, but it's manageable. But what if there are more rooms? What if there are 5 or 6 or 10 rooms within earshot? And what if instead of being areas 43 and 44 right next to each other in your notes, there's also areas 52, 63, 57, and 84. That's getting a lot harder to juggle. And we've just gotten started because so far we've only considered the simple case of having the bad guys hear the fight and then come rushing to help. But what if the Modron over in Area 57 decides the most logical course of action is to fetch reinforcements? Where would it go to find them? And now you're not just flipping around trying to find nearby bad guys to activate, you're flipping through the whole dungeon, trying to figure out where the nearest barracks are. And what would the response of the goblins in the barracks be? And what other areas will be affected by them as they start looking for the PCs? You can see how quickly this becomes completely impossible, even for the most experienced game masters. We separated these rooms because we can't run them all at the same time. The firewall is too valuable. To run a truly dynamic dungeon, a dungeon teeming with life and activity and strategic complexity, without driving ourselves crazy, we need a fundamentally different approach and a new set of tools. Now, one tool we could use is a random encounter table. Rolling a random encounter won't make the goblins in Area 44 check out what's going on next door, but it will add active monsters to your dungeon. It'll break up the idea that the monsters are just, sitting in their rooms, passively waiting for the PCs to come and kick down their door. We'll talk more about breathing life into your random encounters in an upcoming video, so hit the subscribe button in the font of all knowledge to make sure you don't miss out on that. But what we're going to talk about today are adversary rosters. When we add monsters to a dungeon, we add them to our adventure key. And because the primary thing that we key, or describe, in a dungeon scenario is the room, we add our monsters to specific rooms. These are the goblins in the library. These are the security guards in the op center. And when we do this, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of the monsters as belonging to that room. But our whole goal with a dynamic dungeon is to not have the denizens tied down to a specific room. We want them free to move around and respond to events in the way that real people do. So we shouldn't key them to specific rooms. We need a different way of keying them, of adding them to our adventure notes. And that's the adversary roster. It's ultimately just a list of dungeon denizens separate from the room key. The basic building block of the adversary roster is the action group. Now, you rarely want to track every single individual in the dungeon, so you group them together for easier management. Of course, some of your action groups can be just a single guy, if that's what's most useful or makes the most sense for the scenario. You'll also list the starting location for each action group. Most of the time, an action group will consist of all the adversaries in a single location at the beginning of the adventure. But sometimes you'll want to take a really big group and split it up into smaller units. For example, maybe there are a dozen goblins in the barracks. Rather than one big group of 12, it might make more sense to have 2 action groups of 6. And now figuring out whether to use one action group or multiple action groups is is pretty much entirely utilitarian. Do you think that the group is likely to split up and take independent action? Well, then it should be 2 action groups. And if not, then it should be 1. The other key thing here is that the action groups are only listed on the adversary roster. They're not listed in the room keys anymore. Instead, when you're running the adventure, you look up both the room key, which describes the room, and then check the adversary roster to see if there's an action group there. And if there is, then you obviously just include the action group in your description of the room. And the great thing, of course, is that you can use the adversary roster to very quickly figure out where everyone is in the dungeon. And you can also easily move those action groups around, actively responding to the PCs and their actions. All you have to do is periodically update the adversary roster with the group's current location. Now, this does, of course, increase the complexity of running the scenario, but it's not the exponential cascading increase that we saw before. You're no longer looking at just one room key at a time, but instead of trying to juggle 6 room keys all at once, you can usually limit yourself to looking at just the dungeon map, the current room key, and the adversary roster. You can still keep all the information you need right at your fingertips. Now, when I'm actually running my action groups, I tend to think of them as belonging to one of several types. First, you've got mobile groups. These are kind of the default. They're keyed to a specific location, but are generally willing and able to respond to the activities of the PCs, wherever they may be. An example of this is when one of the goblins from Area 4 flees to tell the ogre in Area 14 what's happening. The ogre and his 2 henchmen are another action group, and while they start setting up an ambush for the PCs, the ogre orders the goblin to fetch the scale mages from Area 8. Now, the second type of action group is the patrol. These groups make regular circuits through a dungeon. For example, when the goblin survivor arrives in Area 8, I might note that in addition to the scale mages, there's also a guard patrol that passes through this area. While the scale mages go to answer the Ogre King's call, the guard patrol, alerted to the PC's presence, rushes off to fetch their battle wargs. Or maybe something completely different, right? I mean, these aren't scripted events. The whole point is that the adversary roster empowers you to actively play the dungeon in response to the PC's actions. I mean, if the PCs had stopped that original goblin from escaping, none of this would be happening. Now, as far as patrols are concerned, though, you can indicate the areas they're patrolling in the notes section of your adversary roster. You can use these notes for all kinds of useful stuff. For example, maybe this action group is carrying a key to the Dwarven Vault in Area 23. Or maybe one of your action groups is currently asleep. When we're talking about patrols, I'll often list their specific route. For example, they might go from Area 8 to Area 9 to Area 12 to the Vault in Area 23, and then back to Area 8. Now, our third type of action group is mostly stationary. These groups are unlikely to leave the area they're keyed to. They just won't respond when the alarm is raised for whatever reason. This might be a choice on their part, or it might not. Our battle wargs are an example of this. The goblins keep them in a kennel, so unless some of the goblins go and fetch them, the wargs will stay where they are until the PCs show up. Adversaries waiting in ambush are another common example of this type. They might go on the move if it makes sense, but they're far more likely to wait until the PCs come to them so that they can spring the ambush they have planned. Now, because it's still very possible for mostly stationary action groups to become mobile, I'll definitely list them on my adversary roster. But because they're less likely to move, I'll indent their entries to clearly distinguish them from more active groups. Finally, we have stationary adversaries. These are groups which will never leave the location they're in, and because they'll never leave the location they start in, I actually won't include these adversaries on the roster. Instead, I'll just list them in the appropriate room key. I mean, after all, if they'll only be encountered in that room no matter what, there's no reason to clutter up the roster with them. Stationary groups might include literally immobile creatures, those simply uninterested in the rest of the complex, or creatures that are sealed away until the PCs disturb them. Of course, if the PCs unleash the Mummy Queen sealed within the lower vault and then run away, I might add the now very active Mummy Queen to my adversary roster for the rest of the adventure. And this is actually another cool thing about adversary rosters. They make it super easy to restock your dungeons as the denizens are killed, replaced, or retasked. Because you've separated the denizens from the key, you don't need to go through and rekey every room with new monsters. You can just create a new adversary roster, often using the exact same room key or a key with minimal changes. For example, The PCs attack the Ogre King's domain and they retreat. The Ogre knows they're coming back, so he calls in the goblin hunting parties from the surrounding countryside. When the PCs do, in fact, return, they find the whole lair reinforced, and all you needed to do was spend 5 minutes creating a new roster listing the reinforcements. I mean, that's so easy you could do it in the middle of a session. And maybe on the second expedition, harried by goblin patrols and scale mages, the PCs are forced to flee into the lower vaults, and there they awake the Mummy Queen before making their escape once more. And this time when they come back, they discover that the Mummy Queen has slain the Ogre King, usurped his rule, and raised the goblin dead as scarab zombies. And at this point, the dungeon is anything but static. But we've also got lots and lots of action groups running around, so how do we keep track of them all? Now, most of the time, you can just use the adversary roster itself, writing down each group's location, then updating it when they move. But here, come take a peek at this. If you print out a copy of your dungeon map, you can lay it out on the table in front of you, just like a table map. And then you can use numbered chits like this to identify the location of each action group. All you need to do is number each of your action groups on the adversary roster, and you can even move them around the dungeon, like you were playing a board game or something like that. Now, in this case, we have a caravanserai, a 2-story building with balconies looking down onto lower floors and windows looking down into the courtyard. If a fight breaks out down here in the courtyard, which of the bad guys inside the building will be able to see what's happening? Now, with the counters and the adversary roster, it becomes easy for you to see that there are archers in Area 15 and Area 20 who have windows that look down into the courtyard. You can also see that there are reinforcements in the stables in Area 7 and the dining hall in Area 3 who can come rushing out to help reinforce the gate guards at the front of the caravanserai. The entire caravanserai is trivially transformed into a dynamic, multi-level theater of operations. In fact, is this whole fight here in the courtyard just a distraction to pull the guards from the rear gate in Area 9 up and around into the courtyard, while a different group of PCs sneaks in through the back gate and tries to gain secret entrance into the caravanserai? And if so, will the guards up here in Area 16 be able to look out the windows and see the PCs passing below? Maybe. Numbered counters are pretty easy to find. You can also make your own by printing out numbers and gluing them to washers or quarters or something like that. You want something with a little bit of weight, though, so that your action groups don't get blown away by a passing wind elemental. If you're using a virtual tabletop, of course, it can be even easier to set this up. If you do the prep work to place all your monsters on the scenario map before play begins, you can just zoom out and manage them in real time. It can also help to prep stat block sheets for your action groups. Depending on the role-playing game you're using, you might be able to put the stats for all of your action groups on a single sheet, but if you're playing a game with more complicated stat blocks, you might need to do a separate sheet for each action group. Either way, no matter where the PCs encounter the action group, you'll be able to easily grab the relevant stat blocks. In fact, you can put that sheet on the table right next to your dungeon map. Now that you've got all your action groups on the move, though, one pitfall you can fall into is having everybody in the dungeon immediately swarm the PCs. Now, sometimes that's the logical outcome of the PC's actions, and that's fine. Your players will quickly learn to take approaches that don't result in that happening and to retreat and regroup if it does. But in running a dynamic dungeon, you should bear in mind the fog of war. Even if the PCs attack one action group, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the dungeon will immediately know what's happening. And even if the alarm does go up, some action groups may be assigned to guard other areas, or simply have no idea exactly where the crisis is happening, particularly if the PCs are on the move. The adversary roster gives you the opportunity to role-play the entire dungeon. Seize that opportunity. Really think about what each adversary or group of adversaries knows and what they would do with that knowledge. And while you're role-playing each action group, look for opportunities to seek the new status quo for them. In other words, just because an action group has been set in motion, it doesn't mean they have to stay in motion. When the Ogre King sends a squad of goblins to guard the Dwarven Vault, those goblins will go to the vault and then they'll stay at the vault. Once that happens, you can stop thinking about them. Or at least you can stop thinking about them until the PCs do something to set them into motion again, right? Finding this new status quo and letting action groups settle down is a vital technique for keeping the number of action groups you're currently juggling under control, down to a manageable number. In fact, If you're ever in a situation where you feel like your adversary roster is getting out of control, that just means that you need to identify which action groups can logically go back into a holding pattern, whether that's stopping in one room, establishing a new patrol pattern, or going back to their original one. Of course, the more practice you get running scenarios with adversary rosters, the more action groups will become comfortable running at the same time. There are also a bunch of advanced adversary techniques that I share in So You Want to Be a Game Master, and you'll be able to take advantage of those after you master basic adversary rosters. Once you start running dynamic dungeons, one of the things you'll discover is that you'll also need to start thinking differently about encounter design. When you're running static dungeons with isolated encounters, you need each individual encounter to be challenging in its own right. Because the players are more or less free to reset their resources after every encounter, every fight needs to push the PCs to the brink and threaten disastrous defeat, because otherwise, what would be the point? When you're running a dynamic dungeon, on the other hand, the primary challenge comes not from the tactics of the individual encounter, although these are still important, but from the strategy of the entire dungeon. It's not enough to win the battle, you have to win the war. It's a richer and deeper style of play. And the core concept here is combining encounters. Obviously, when you're running dynamic dungeons, whether you're using adversary rosters or some other tool, multiple action groups can join together into a single encounter. If you design each action group as if it were a skin-of-your-teeth static encounter, then when two or more of those action groups merge into a single dynamic encounter, they'll annihilate your PCs. What you generally want instead are action groups that, if encountered alone, are relatively easy encounters, but that can become increasingly dangerous encounters if they are allowed to join together. This means that you, as the game master, don't need to pull the bad guy's punches, which in turn creates a strategically interesting scenario, baking in the default strategic goal of don't let them gang up on us. This is a fairly basic goal, of course, but one that can support a lot of different solutions depending on the circumstances. The players might use stealth, overwhelming strikes, negotiation, or anything else they can imagine. More importantly, it builds a firm foundation on which more complicated and custom strategies can be built. The principles of dynamic encounter design are pretty straightforward. First, you usually don't want an encounter with one big bad guy. These can be a nice change of pace, but single opponents are difficult to keep balanced and tactically interesting against a gaggle of PCs. It's better to have encounters with lots of opponents to provide tactical complexity. Second, encounters with a single action group will likely have little immediate risk, but they'll still require some strategic ablation of resources. In other words, an encounter with one action group should be able to wear the group down. The PC should lose a few hit points, need to cast some of their spells for the day, and that sort of thing. An encounter with 2 or 3 action groups, on the other hand, should be a challenge encounter, but a risky one. When 4 or 5 action groups all join together, however, that's when things are going to get tough. The PC should still be able to win the fight, but it may be touch and go for a while, or require some clever thinking by the players. You'll be helped here because such encounters usually develop over time, with the 4th or 5th action groups joining in the middle of combat, which means the PCs won't be facing all the bad guys at the same time. Now, what you can see from these principles is that a dynamic dungeon empowers you to have a larger range of potential encounters, ranging from the easy to the extremely difficult, without any of those encounters becoming meaningless filler. Exactly how these principles will apply in a specific role-playing game will depend on exactly how that game is designed. In D&D 5th edition, for example, most of your action groups should be designed as low difficulty encounters. Use moderate difficulty action groups sparingly. The key thing to remember is that a couple of moderate difficulty action groups joining up together can very easily become an ultra-lethal encounter. That's why you want to use them as a light spice. High difficulty action groups should almost never be used. You're almost always better off letting such encounters emerge from the strategic flow of the scenario. But this does mean that when you roll out the very rare high difficulty encounter, particularly in non-dynamic situations, you're going to get real bang for your buck.
They have a cave troll.
Now, if you're playing a different role-playing game and the game gives you similar concrete guidelines for gauging difficulty, you can probably use those as a basis for dialing in the encounter design that you need. If it doesn't, then you'll need to experiment a bit to figure out what easy, challenging, and potentially overwhelming encounters look like, and the various ways you can split them apart into effective action groups. Now, as always, your group's mileage may vary. Clever and resourceful players may find ways to dominate your dungeons. If that's happening regularly at your table, feel free to crank things up a bit until you find the sweet spot for you and yours. Now, it may help to keep in mind that you have to miss by a lot and for a very long time before too easy will ruin your campaign. But you only have to miss once and by a little bit for too hard to cause a TPK. It may also be useful to remember that successfully slipping through a situation unscathed that you know could have turned into a complete clusterfuck can be a thrilling, edge-of-your-seat thrill ride for your players, and perhaps a welcome change of pace from all the clusterfucks that will inevitably happen in every other scenario. Now, one of the key things to really grok about dynamic dungeons is that, to at least some extent, it gives the players a degree of control over the encounters they face. With sufficient strategic cleverness, they can even design their own encounters, keeping encounters easy by preventing action groups from joining together, luring enemies to locations of their choosing, and so forth. This is very different from a static dungeon where the encounters are locked to specific rooms, and you, as the game master, are solely responsible for designing every single aspect of them. In a dynamic dungeon, it's not your job to crush the PCs. It's your job to set the stakes high and give them the opportunity to screw up and push themselves to the breaking point. Now, on the other hand, not every dungeon needs to be or should be a dynamic one. Adversary rosters are a technique for locations with active bad guys. Not every dungeon needs a roster. Sometimes the PCs really are cracking open dusty tombs that have lain undisturbed for centuries, and they have only themselves to blame when they awaken the eldritch horrors within. Variety is the spice of life, after all, and good scenario design is often about finding the right tool for the job. We'll be exploring more ways to advance your dungeons in future 5-star dungeon videos, so make sure to hit the subscribe button before it fetches reinforcements, and grab your own copy of So You Want to Be a Game Master at the links below. Good gaming. This is Justin Alexander, and I'll see you at the table.